Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Wendy Brown, Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley, where she is a core faculty member in the designated emphasis in critical theory. Her recent books include Undoing the Demos, Neoliberalism, Stealth Revolution, and her latest book is In the Ruins of Neoliberalism, The Rise of Antidemocratic Politics in the West. Welcome to Background Briefing, Wendy Brown.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you. And did neoliberalism emerge out of the end of the Cold War?
It emerged at the same time as the end of the Cold War, but I wouldn't say that they were causal. Neoliberalism as an actual mode of governing and a mode of thinking in the north part of the world emerged in response to a series of crises in capitalism in the 70s. What we barely can remember as the phenomenon called stagflation, the oil crises, and what is generally understood by economists across the political spectrum as a crisis in profitability for large corporate capital.
So it wasn't the case then that during the Cold War the struggle was between democracy and communism, and then when the communists collapsed, the struggle became, or at least the dichotomy became, between capitalism and communism, capitalism not being an ideology so much as a fact.
I would put the matter a little differently and say that it was a struggle between capitalism and communism all along. Mm-hmm. We called it, on our side of the Cold War, a struggle between democracy and communism, or as often, a struggle between democracy and totalitarianism. But it was two competing political economic systems with various iterations on both sides. And then neoliberalism brings us something else altogether.
But could you make the case that on both sides the ideology is somewhat fraudulent, particularly on the Russian or the Soviet communism side? It was a political system pretending to be an economy, and of course we see China, which is the only large communist country left, and it's basically a capitalist mafia overseeing a rampant form of capitalism.
So if what you're asking is, what was really at stake in the Cold War, mm-hmm. What was really at stake in the Cold War were two superpowers fighting for hegemony in the world and for territory in a very concrete sense, mm-hmm. Through a series of hot and cold wars on both sides, under the name of democracy and communism. Now, certainly, I would argue that communism bore no resemblance to the ideal that the 19th century socialists, and in particular Marx, had of a political economic system that would be free, more free than anything human beings had ever experienced, because it would be collectively owned and controlled, and it would also produce an enormous amount of freedom from toil, from labor, from the experience of taking care of necessity, and instead allow human beings to thrive and flourish. Communism obviously bore no resemblance to that as it was actually practiced. But I would also say that the Cold War itself, if that's what we're trying to decipher before we move to our decades after it, sure. Was a political battle, a geopolitical battle, that was also waged ideologically on both sides, that, of course, as you say, had a tremendous amount of mythology, mystique, ideology, obfuscation on the part of both superpowers.
So moving to the subject of your current book and your previous book, Wendy Brown, if communism during the Cold War was a corruption of the idealism of Marx, what is neoliberalism then a corruption of, or is there a dream to begin with before it's shattered or before it's corrupted?
Absolutely. It's a great question. The founding neoliberals who emerged in the interwar and post-war period, that is, right after World War II, that's when they really got together and began thinking together. The common names we know there are Friedman, Hayek. Less common in the United States are the ordo-liberals, that is, less commonly known are the ordo-liberals. But there are many schools of neoliberalism, Where they converged is they all believed that any form of social state, any form of social justice and social redistribution, economic, but also social justice oriented toward political and moral concerns, that any form of that would strengthen the state and produce state intervention of the wrong sort and lead toward a totalitarian state. So where they converged was in a belief that democracy had to be, in a sense, minimized, limited to elections, to the securing of individual rights, and to the peaceful transfer of power. And that beyond that, it should not be the case that democracy should be that which organized our understanding of the common good. They didn't believe in the common good. They only believed in an ordering of society by markets and by moral tradition. And so their vision was of a state that was a fairly strong state, but devoted to securing the conditions for traditional morality and free markets to govern the lives of human beings. And they also envisioned a seriously depoliticized or neutralized citizenry, but at the same time imagined that they could, by making a state simply oriented toward creating competitiveness in markets and securing moral tradition, that they could also limit the interests that would warp governments or states that might emerge from things like concentrated wealth. So their aim was to both get rid of the problem of fascism at the top, tyrants, plutocrats, whatever you want to call them, and to get rid of the problem at the bottom, the myth-mongering, mobilized masses, and instead just have lean technocratic states by morality and by markets. So where did the dream go wrong? Well, of course, as with Marxism, the neoliberals didn't really think through the serious problem of how political power could be gained and gamed by concentrated interests. They underestimated the ability of the masses to be bought off by traditional family morality and by markets, and they underestimated the capacity of states to be reduced to technocratic instruments. So we got a kind of monster form of neoliberalism. We got plutocracy, we got populism, we got finance capital, we got orders of concentrated interests and rent-seeking economies that was precisely the opposite of what the neoliberals imagined. That said, and I'll conclude this long answer to your question here, I would argue that the concurrent rise of the authoritarian right comes very much from the seeding of the ground that neoliberalism gave us. Why? Because above all, neoliberalism attacked democracy and put in its place the supervenient value of markets, of individual freedom, and of traditional morality. That was the package, and that's what got rolled out by the Reagan-Thatcher revolution, by the European Union, and a number of other places. And even if it went wrong, that's very much what we're seeing now bearing fruit in the rise of an authoritarian, tradition-mongering, freedom-wielding, right-wing political formation.
And again, I'm speaking with Wendy Brown, who's a professor of political science at the University of California, Berkeley, where she is a core faculty member in the designated emphasis in critical theory. Her recent books include Undoing the Demos, Neoliberalism, Stealth Revolution, and her latest book, just out, is In the Ruins of Neoliberalism, The Rise of Antidemocratic Politics in the West. So, but much of the critique of neoliberalism, of course, comes from the left, who feel that people like Tony Blair and Bill Clinton and even Barack Obama got elected to improve the lives of the working class and middle class and ended up sitting in hot tubs at Davos with billionaires, wringing their hands over the fate of the world and of the poor. So why is that when you talk about the Reagan and company, what's the culpability of the alternatives to Reagan, or the ones on the left, so as to speak, that such
You've already put it beautifully. They weren't significant alternatives. It's not that they weren't attached to certain kinds of progressive values, more equality for women, more inclusion and equality for disenfranchised minorities, a little more concern with climate change and that sort of thing. But the basic mantra continued to be the belief in deregulated markets, the affirmation of a state that existed not to intervene in people's lives, but rather to produce a globalized neoliberal order, free trade, which in turn produced a race to the bottom, suffered mostly by, or not mostly, but suffered importantly by working class and middle class workers in the North. The neoliberals knew this would happen. The founding neoliberals knew this would happen. They knew that if you really deregulated trade around the world and let capital chase cheap labor wherever it wanted to, the result would be a declining status of workers in the global North. What they imagined is that decline could be bought off in various ways, and that's something they underestimated. But you're absolutely right. The Clintons, the Blairs, the Obamas, and so forth did not break significantly from neoliberal economics. Where they did depart was from the fusion that the founding neoliberals had established between an order of society governed by markets and traditional morality. And that's where the only significant difference is. So you're absolutely right. They perpetuated the inequalities. They perpetuated the disaster that we're now confronting, both in the form of a significant crisis of global inequality and a significant crisis of the climate.
So let's move then to your new book, In the Ruins of Neoliberalism, The Rise of Antidemocratic Politics in the West, Wendy Brown. And clearly Donald Trump, Bolsonaro and company are the mutated offspring of neoliberalism. And of course, neoliberalism hasn't not gone away, because in this current Democratic presidential race, you have two billionaires running on the Democratic ticket.
Absolutely. So the big question is, how did the reaction to neoliberalism turn in a strongly ethno-nationalist direction on the right and take the form that it's taken on the left, which is a little bit hazy, disorganized, oscillating between continuing as usual in the center and then an objection to neoliberal deprivations and depredations of the common good, the public good, human lives, and so forth that you get from the left. One of the things we probably need to explore here is how ethno-nationalism is born out of a reaction to neoliberalism. And one of the things I would suggest and argue in the book is that the privatization of society that neoliberalism accomplishes in the 90s, the fulfillment of Thatcher's dicta that there is no such thing as society, there's only individual men and women, and the fulfillment of the ownership society mantra that we get from both Bushes, that fulfillment, that realization is carried to sort of new heights by the notion that the nation itself is a private object that is owned by those who take it to be their entitlement, their belonging, and that's, of course, white, working, and middle-class people who claim this is ours, this belongs to us. And you see that chant, that mantra, that slogan in everything from Make America Great Again to Marine Le Pen saying, this is our house, the house belongs to us, we ought to have the keys to decide whether to lock it up or open the door. You see it in the white Poland, white Europe slogans that carry across all the national parties, all the right-wing parties.